Hey guys, Mr. Pokke here, back with another video. On this week's episode of CN Unit Analysis, we'll be talking about Topaz. Being our very first 5-star Hunt limited unit, Topaz is here to shake up the playstyles from the traditional hypercarry team comps. First, we've had Kafka strengthening DOT compositions, and now Topaz is here to bring follow-up attack comps to its glory. With impressive damage amplification via Proof of Death, as well as respectable personal damage output with Numby, Topaz is an extremely fun unit that breaks the traditional Anga-Bunga playstyle of a typical hypercarry. Of course, with new playstyles comes the new thought processes in order to maximize Topaz performance with her team. This guide will seek to equip players with the knowledge to make full use of Topaz kit, as well as the ideal team compositions, although the latter is much more diverse, so a second video will be used to discuss her team comps, right? So without further ado, let's jump into today's content. Now, talking about Topaz helpful tips, the first of all being Topaz can be played as a main DPS. This is following the same logic as hypercarry Kafka, where we essentially run Kafka with Ting Yun, Asta as well as a sustain to just increase Kafka's damage output, increase her ultimate, increase her skills multipliers, and just let her deal tons of damage by herself without relying on external DOT units. Similarly, Topaz can still deal substantial amounts of damage by herself even without other follow-up attackers, largely because of how effective Ting Yun as an energy battery is, because for the majority of Topaz damage output, it is tied to Numby being in its enhanced state after Topaz casts her ultimate. So with Ting Yun as an energy battery, it allows Numby to almost have 100% enhanced follow-up uptime, and after testing, each enhanced follow-up attack can easily hit for over 100,000 damage, which certainly makes Topaz as a main DPS viable for any sort of team compositions. For players who do not have a main DPS and you're considering on not pulling for Topaz because she might not be built as a main DPS, rest assured the damage output that Topaz will provide is still going to be there, albeit it's probably not going to be as strong as the traditional hypercarries such as Jingliu or Sile or Imbuter Lune. Moving on, during ultimate, Topaz can provide Numby with a 100% action value advance by herself. Now what do I mean by this is that currently, Topaz talent and ultimate, they trigger independently, meaning that any of Topaz's basic and skill is considered both a basic attack / skill and a follow-up. So this essentially transforms a backloaded damage kit from summoned units like the Lightning Lord to be front-loaded instantly, right? The moment you cast Topaz ultimate and then use her basic attack or use a skill, Numby will instantly gain 100% action value advance and she will just immediately go, which further increases Topaz fluidity as both a main DPS and a sub DPS. Note that this also works for allies, but currently it is only in Simulated Universe where we have the Cat's Cradle Elation buff, which considers our units' ultimates as a follow-up attack damage, right? So in the future, we may see something like this similar going on, but for now, only Topaz can consistently make use of this mechanic outside of Simulated Universe. Another point to note is that Topaz can be skill point positive. Notice that I wrote a little but over here, right? But first of all, Topaz skill, it has a very low multipliers, only 50% more than her basic attack at level 10 traces, which may seem very terrible to players at first, right? Why is the skill multiplier so low? However, keep in mind that Topaz skill's main usage is marking Proof of Death or pot on the enemy target, which is a 50% increased damage taken for follow-up attack. This is an extremely powerful debuff that benefits her entire kit as well as her follow-up attack allies. Furthermore, this effect can also self-refresh if there are no enemies with pot upon every ally's turn, which means that if our Topaz were to mark a Proof of Death onto an enemy target, let's say for a mob, right? And if our allies eliminated the mob with a POD, next turn, on the next ally's turn, it will instantly refresh onto a random target without using any skill point whatsoever. However, notice the but over here, right? The reason why I wrote this but over here is that this will inevitably lead to a very slow ultimate uptime. Because Topaz ultimate, it allows Numby's attacks to refund 20 total energy, right? 10 per hit. So a slower ultimate will start to have a snowball effect where Topaz ultimate comes up even slower, going as far as 5 turns without energy buffs nor ER rope. Note note that Numby without ultimate buff, it does not generate energy, right? Because this is exactly like Lightning Lord. Lightning Lord's hit, it does not generate energy unless you kill something, right? It is not like Clara's follow-up attack or March 7's follow-up attack. So Numby's follow-up attack will not generate energy. As such, players will need to decide if they will require additional skill point for the team or they would prefer a higher ultimate uptime, which translates into more damage. For the most part, I can say with confidence that players should still try to use more skill points if possible with Topaz, because a majority of her damage is tied to Numby's during her enhanced state, right? So without casting ultimate, you might be skill point positive, but only if this skill point positivity is being translated to a better use, right? You're giving it to a better main carry follow-up attacker, or your supports absolutely need those buffs. But for the most part, Topaz should still be using her skills. And lastly, Numby can actually go twice or even thrice in the very first turn. So this is what happening, right? When we use our technique, it will instantly bring out Topaz energy to 125, which is 65 plus 60 energy out of 130. And then she just needs to get hit, or she just needs to kill something within a period of time, and then Topaz will be able to instantly have an ultimate on the very first turn. So to further add on to this, it will be a little bit of a waste if Topaz were to go before Numby, and ideally we want to get the full benefit of this ultimate buff after Numby is gone before Topaz. So it will be Numby, Topaz, Numby again. So this is the ideal situation, because remember, for our point number 2, Topaz can provide Numby with a 100% action value advance after casting ultimate. We need a follow-up attacker to counter and hit the enemy that's marked with proof of that at the very start of the battle, right? So if this happens and the enemy counters and it creates this additional action value for Numby to go, then Numby will be able to act before Topaz, even if Topaz is at like 140 or 150 speed and Numby is only 80 speed. But of course, this is not very reliable, right? You need to rely on your follow-up attacker to specifically counter the unit with the proof of that debuff. So it's just something good to know that Numby can actually go a lot of times in a single turn, even more so with Team Green, right? But that is that for Topaz helpful tips. Now moving on to Trace priority, is very straightforward, right? Her skill over ultimate / talent over basic attack. Either as a sub DPS or main DPS, proof of that's debuff will always take priority as it directly increases all follow-up damage, including Topaz and Numby herself, right? The ultimate and talent, it will seek to improve Numby's DPS through increasing Numby's multipliers, although the ultimate does increase both the damage multipliers and the crit damage at the expense of a less permanent uptime as compared to a talent, right? But both of these skills, they are equally important, since we all know Numby is a very large portion of Topaz damage output. So these two skills, it should still be leveled, but of course skill is way more important, especially when you consider the debuffs. And then well, for her major traces, Overdraft will take precedence over Storm's Market, taking over precedence over Financial Turmoil. But just to note, all 3 of Topaz's major traces, they are extremely beneficial and players should unlock them all if possible, or rather whenever possible, right? But in terms of priority, Overdraft is by far the most important, but essentially transforming her into a skill point positive sub DPS once proof of that is applied, since now her basic attack can also increase Numby's action value. So this is extremely important. Next, Storm's Market technically has more usage than Financial Turmoil, since the latter is only effective against fire weak enemies. So if we're going to be using Topaz as a sub DPS for a hyper carry that is not in the fire element, then Financial Turmoil is not going to be as effective. Whereas Storm's Market, it will definitely help with the ultimate uptime and all this kind of good stuff, so that's going to take the second priority. Now moving on to Topaz's special mechanic, which I think by now we should all know is Numby. Numby is Topaz's special mechanic, and she's essentially the Fire Lightning Lord, right? Numby is where majority of Topaz's DPS come from, and even more so than Jingyuan's percentage compared to Lightning Lord, because as we know, Jingyuan currently, his damage output is roughly 40% from his skills and ultimate and 60% from his Lightning Lord. For Topaz, this is even more extreme. I would dare say 20 or even less than 20% of the damage is coming from Topaz's skill and basic attacks alone, right? Because all of the damage is focused entirely on Numby landing the enhanced follow-up attacks, since Topaz ultimate is a buff for Numby. So for players to fully maximize Numby's damage, they should aim to use as much follow-up attacks as possible to increase Numby's action value, especially since Numby's speed is unaffected by other buffs, right? And below is essentially a chart of how often Numby acts with Topaz in a hyper carry setup, which easily outputs over 100,000 damage per hit, like I mentioned earlier just now, right? So just taking a look at this chart over here, we can see that for every 3 Topaz actions, Numby actually moves 5 times. Do note that this simulation over here is done with a Topaz using attack percentage boots and no other follow-up attack sources, right? Because she's a hyper carry here. So realistically, there should be a much higher frequency for both Topaz and Numby's movements, as well as ultimate uptime, which is also why I'll explain this a little bit later on why Topaz wants to run speed boots. So that aside, regardless if Topaz is a main DPS or a sub DPS, Numby's damage output should not be underestimated, and as a main DPS, it will receive buffs from Topaz supports such as Tini and Asta to give Numby increased damage whenever he casts his enhanced follow-up attack, right? But do note that single turn buffs like Bronya's skill, it will not affect Numby, just like how Lightning Lord also doesn't gain Bronya's skill unless your Bronya's at E6. On the other hand, as a sub DPS, Numby can move very frequently due to a higher follow-up attack frequency rate, which also benefits from the proof of that debuff triggered by Topaz. So either way, Numby, it is a very integral part of Topaz kit, and I can see why the devs named her as Topaz and Numby. On this note of Numby, right, one last thing before we move on is that we actually don't really have a summoned unit specific support yet, and as such, there's still more rooms for us to grow this entire archetype of summoned units in general. So perhaps in the future, we may get a support that further increases our energy regeneration other than Ting Yun, or some sort of speed/action value buff that buffs Numby outside of Topaz kit. For this, we will have to wait for future units as well as relic sets to see what kind of additional damage we can deal with Numby going forward. But for now, for the most part, Numby's supporters is largely going to be Ting Yun and Asta, especially for Ting Yun because energy buff is really good on Numby, which essentially can give Topaz like a 2-turn ultimate most of the time, right? Moving on to Topaz Eidolon Benefits, her Eidolon 1 is actually marginal benefits unless we're going to be using Topaz in a follow-up attack comp, which is essentially a stronger full strength Eidolon 1, which provides a team-wide 30% crit damage. And this benefit, Topaz Eidolon 1, it only benefits follow-up attacks. So for the most part, if you're not going to be running follow-up attack comps, then players can consider this only if they are interested in building follow-up attack comps, right? But if you guys just want Topaz to deal more damage herself, then it is perfectly viable to just run her as an E0 and then just give her all the support buffs, right? Like Ting Yun buffs, Asta buffs, or even Bronya buffs, right? So that's her Eidolon 1. Now, Eidolon 2, this is a game-changing Eidolon. You can see from the chart over here is almost a 21% increase in final damage output. Now, why is this the case? It's because the assumption over here is very hard to estimate exactly how many times Topaz can generate this 5 energy because it's entirely dependent on how many times Numby was going to take action, right? So the author here essentially assumed that Topaz will achieve a 2-turn ultimate very frequently, almost 100% uptime, which currently it is not possible without Ting Yun or a reliance on RNG. So assuming that this 20% final damage increase is that Topaz can ensure 2 turns ultimates, then you can see that this damage is going to be absolutely through the roof, right? Because we essentially have almost 100% uptime for Numby's enhanced follow-up attack. And this is very promising if we get more energy battery system in the future, because currently right now we really only have Ting Yun, but in the future if there are more units that supplies us with energy, then Topaz Eidolon 2 is going to see a lot of value, irregardless if she's a main DPS or a sub DPS. Also, I'm going to be explaining this a little bit more below, but this also opens up the door for ER rope Topaz. Before E2, Topaz really doesn't need ER rope, right? She's perfectly fine running attack percentage, but I digress. Now, Topaz E4, when combined with E2, it creates a mutually beneficial cycle between faster ultimates for Topaz as well as faster Topaz actions after Numby takes their turn, right? So overall, it just increases the pace of both Numby and Topaz skill cycles at the same time, where both of them just acts more frequently, but for the most part, this is not as impactful as, let's say, Eidolon 1 or even Eidolon 2, right? So that's going to be that. Now, Eidolon 6, this is, as usual, Eidolon 6 is always going to be a unit's highest damage increase, and this is to no exception, right? So how did we get this raw 25% damage increase? Mainly due to 2 reasons. Number 1, fire res down, or in fact, any res down debuffs is always going to be an extremely strong modifier because it is not depreciative from any attack damage percentage or attack percentage buffs, right? Because you can stack on a lot of those from your hyper carriers, from your team, from your Bronya, but there's very little units in this game right now where we can stack on res down, right? So because of this, res down will always be an extremely good debuff to have. Secondly is that Numby's extra enhanced attack, which now he will hit for 3 times before expiring, it will provide us with 10 additional energy, right? Because every single time during enhanced state, Numby does give us back energy. On top of that, it also gives us more damage because it is now, we literally get 1 more turn of enhanced damage. So imagine once you have E6 Topaz, right? you're now ulting every 2 turns with your E2/E4 combine. And from those 2 turns, Numby is going to go super fast due to E4, and he's just going to deal tons of damage because of the fire res down. And the cycle, all of Topaz Eidolons, it is very synergistic with one another, right? So E1 buffs the Followup damage, E2 make sure that we cast ultimate more frequently, E4 make sure that we move more frequently so that we can cast our ultimate more frequently, and then E6 is for each frequent ultimate we have, we're going to be dealing even more damage, right? Topaz E0 is already perfectly viable. E1 is for people that want to build a Followup Protect team comp. E2 is for Topaz that want to build ER rope as well as just having higher ultimate uptime. And E6 is for a massive damage increase. This is essentially the knot that ties the whole gift together, right? It will just combine everything together and just make Topaz a very formidable DPS even without any other Followup attackers. So that is that for Topaz Eidolon benefits. Now moving on to Topaz energy thresholds, it's very straightforward because we don't have a Lightcone that provides us with energy values, and I'm not going to be talking about Eidolon 6 because that is really like the whale territory. So for Eidolon 0 and Eidolon 2, you can see that even without running ER rope, we scale 3 times consecutively, we're going to be at 115 energy. So during these 3 turns, we're going to need to either have 2 kills or 2 hits to achieve a 3-turn ultimate. And this is very manageable for Topaz, especially she's going to be a main DPS or even as a sub DPS, because Numby, she does go forward even when our allies are the ones doing the follow-up damage, right? And then if Numby gets the kill, then Topaz still gets the energy. So for the most part, Numby does not need to run ER rope at Eidolon 0. So if Topaz does run ER rope, you can see that we can now go for a skill, basic attack skill cycle, and we're going to be left with 125 energy, and we just need to get 1 more hit or 1 more kill to ensure a 3-turn ultimate while we save 2 skill points. So yes, players can consider running ER rope on Topaz, especially as a sub DPS, right? You don't mind losing out on the additional attack you're going to have, then you're still going to have a pretty high uptime for dealing 3-turn ultimates. But note that for either of these cases, it is almost impossible to generate a 2-turn ultimate, right? It's really just impossible unless you have team win. Then moving on to Eidolon 2, you can see that for triple skill, we basically don't even need to get kills anymore, right? Because we just need to have 3 procs of our E2, which is very doable since, like I mentioned just now, all the way back, Numby acts a lot faster than Topaz just because of how much additional action value she gained from all of the follow-up attacks, and Topaz during her ultimate state is basically just triggering Numby's action value advance twice, right? So for the most part, it is really straightforward to maintain this 3 procs of E2, and as such, we have a perfect 3-turn ultimate without relying on RNG whatsoever. But at this point of the game, since you already have E2, why I say it is advisable to start running an ER rope, because once you have an ER rope with E2, you are officially skill point positive and you can still cast 3 turns ultimates, right? If you want to be skill point positive without being in E2, you're going to cast your ultimate every 4 or even every 5 turns. So as such, it's really not worth the trade-off, and players should really just consider ER rope if, number 1, you don't mind being a sub DPS, and number 2, you still want a 3-turn ultimate coverage on top of being skill point positive. And just a little bit note over here, we're not going to be factoring the 60 energy gain from the technique, and Numby does not provide energy on hit unless she has a kill, right? So that's going to be that. In summary, Topaz can consider ER rope only after Eidolon 2, because for the most part, it is not advisable for players to sacrifice a 43.4% attack percentage just to guarantee a 3-turn ultimate, especially when you're factoring how low Topaz attack already is, right? You can take a look at the traces. Most of the Topaz traces is all fire damage percentage. There's almost no attack percentage whatsoever, and because of this, we are already running speed boots on Topaz, which I'll be explaining why we'll be running speed boots. So if we're going to be running speed boots with ER rope and no attack traces whatsoever, Topaz attack will be really low, and players do need to factor this into their considerations before throwing away and just guaranteeing a 3-turn ultimate. Now moving on to Topaz Relic Recommendations, shoutouts to my man Bong, he's the one that did up the map over here. Note that in CN's community experience, they don't really think any of this is extremely suitable for Topaz, right? Because you can see here, the best in slot, it really is just a 4-piece Genius Quantum against a Quantum weak enemy, and the next best is going to be 2+2 Firesmith plus Musketeer. So they still believe that in the future, Topaz is going to be having a niche set that will fit her really well. So for players that are thinking of farming for Topaz Relics, their advice is to just hold on for the stamina before the new Relics that eventually comes in the future, right? But that aside, you can see that the reason why Firesmith 4-piece is a bet is also briefly mentioned on my previous CN speculations video, but essentially it's because of two things, right? Number one, Topaz skill damage benefit is very, very low because Topaz skill multiplier is very, very low, right? It's only 150% at level 10. So really, the only thing that matters for fire 4-piece is the additional 12% fire damage that happens once every 3 turns, assuming that we can cast our ultimate once every 3 turns, right? So as such, a permanent 12% attack will benefit Topaz much more. And this is also basically our second point, because in Topaz Traces, it is heavily weighted towards fire damage percentage. And because we don't have enough attack percentage for Topaz herself, that's why a 12% attack will be much more favorable than a 12% fire damage, right? Remember, guys, you should always balance out our attack percentage and damage percentage due to opportunity cost, right? You can't just go all in on damage percentage, just like how you can't go all in on attack percentage, right? So I hope we understand this. And then for 4-piece quantum set, this has always been a universal DPS set due to the potential of defense break stacking, and even at 20% defense shred with no other external sources, no Pella whatsoever, it is already out damaging 2+2, right? So in the future, if we're gonna see more defense break sources, right, we're gonna be running her with Pella, or maybe even a fire debuffer that can cast defense break, then this would be one of, if not the most universal DPS set for anybody, right? So anybody can run this, right? We have seen Jingniu running this, we have seen Imbibitor running this, and now 4-piece Genius is also going to be run on Topaz, right? So that's going to be his Relic recommendations for his 4-piece. Then for his 2-piece planetary set, without any questions, without any surprise, Inert Sasoto is always going to be taking the lead over here. But some of you guys may mention, hey, Mr. Pokke, why is Rutan Arena only 2% off from Inert Sasoto, right? So the reason why is this. There's a very minimum difference right now, you can see over here, in a team setting, right? This is in a team setting. So after Topaz receives the buffs from supports that provide damage percentage buffs, right, such as Tingyun and Bronya, then the difference becomes a lot more minute, because remember, guys, any damage percentage buffs, be it follow-up attack damage percentage, fire damage percentage, or the damage percentage you get from your supports, it is the same multiplier, and it is not to be confused with damage taken percentage. So as such, since Topaz is receiving a lot of external sources of damage percentage, that's why the difference between Inert Sasoto and Rutan Arena is really not that high, right? So in this simulation, if Topaz was to lack the damage percentage buffs, right, if you're not going to be running her with Tingyun, you're running her as a sub DPS, then Inert Sasoto will start to heavily favor over Rutan Arena, right? So just something to keep in mind. And lastly, main stat subsets. This is really, really straightforward, right? Everything here is super straightforward except for maybe 2 things, which is the boots and ER rope. So ER rope, I've already explained just now why players should or shouldn't run ER rope, so that's going to be that. And the reason why Topaz wants speed boots is very simple as well, right? This is to ensure that we have a higher ultimate frequency, since I've mentioned again and again, a majority of Topaz damage output is tied to her ultimate, right? The faster we can cast our ultimate, the more frequently can our Numby go, since now she is no longer restricted to follow-up attack damage, right? Now even our supports can buff Numby's action value cycle on top of increasing Numby's actual damage itself, right? So that's why Topaz should always run speed boots. So that is going to be that for Numby's Relic recommendations. Now moving on to Topaz Lightcone Recommendations. This is going to be a simulation of Topaz damage output with no supports, right? This is basically purely Topaz solo simulations. So you can see over here, without any surprise, her signature Lightcone is going to be the best at 100%, and it is by far the most synergistic Lightcone, right? Crit rate is good, follow-up damage percentage is good, as well as the additional crit damage dealt by any follow-up attacks is all good, right? So keep in mind, this is a personal DPS, right? So this is a solo DPS ranking. So in the future, if you're going to be running Topaz with another follow-up attacker like Clara or maybe some unknown 5-star characters, then Topaz signature Lightcone will start to have a lot more value. Since the tame debuff, it benefits other follow-up attackers, so something to keep in mind. Cruising the Stella CS fight comes in very, very close at 96.06%, and once again, this just goes to show how free-to-play friendly her style Lightcones is, and it's an excellent option for free-to-plays. Note that this is assuming that the 96% here is assuming we gain the maximum benefits from cruising the Stella C, which is gaining both the attack percentage buffs as well as the crit buffs, meaning that it is not very realistic in real-life application, right? So expect a rough 5% damage drop-off when we are going to be using this in a practical scenario, but nonetheless, still an excellent Lightcone substitute for Topaz, right? And then for only Silence Remains, this is a really, really nice 4-star Lightcone because we have a permanent 32% attack buff as well as almost 100% uptime for our 24% crit rate, which makes this really, really good, right? Even surpassing surpassing Silei's Lightcone in the night by 1%. Since Topaz, it is impossible for Topaz to hit more than 4 stacks of in the night, and even 4 stacks is kind of pushing it, unless we're pairing Topaz with Asta, and in which case, if we're going to be pairing Topaz with Asta, then in the night Lightcone's value will definitely shine. And then finally, why is sword play at such a low ranking, right? Like once again, like I mentioned, this is a solo DPS with no other supports, right? So in a solo DPS setting, like I mentioned again and again, Topaz does not require damage percentage, right? It is not as appreciated because she's really missing the attack percentage, right? But note, Topaz is the fastest sword play stacking unit in the entire Honkai Star Rail Hunt category, right? She can instantly stack on 5 stacks of sword play with a single skill. So that's really good to know. And with the help of attack percentage supports like Asta, Bronya, Tingyun, then sword play's value can certainly go up. So in summary, she's not really relying on a signature Lightcone if the players have Herta shops S5, unless players are dedicated to building a Followup attack team compositions. And in this case, then Topaz Eidolon 1 still has more value than Topaz Signature 1, right? Because Eidolon 1 is a 50% crit damage versus 24% crit damage for her Signature 1, excluding Topaz personal stats. So that's going to be her Lightcone recommendations. And finally, we've come to the last portion, which is team compositions. And like I mentioned, we're going to be taking a look in this in a separate video because Topaz team compositions is really interesting. In fact, some of the findings from the CN community, even I didn't think of it, which is running Topaz with Kafka, using Kafka's follow-up attack to enable Topaz, right? But that's going to be for another video. But broadly speaking, the number 1 is going to be Asta Clara, followed by Asta Kafka, which is to my surprise as well followed by Pella Bronya, followed by Clara Tingyun. I was quite shocked to see Himiko not making it into this list, likely due to issues synchronizing and stacking up Himiko's follow-up attack, right? Because Himiko's follow-up attack, if you were to break both walls at the same time, or if you were to break the mobs and the boss at the same time, then it is essentially wasted. She can't gain additional stacks of follow-up that she can stack and let everything go at one shot, right? So she can't do that. So that's a little bit unfortunate. But nonetheless, Himiko should still be a very solid pick against fire weak enemies running Himiko, Topaz, and Asta, right? So players shouldn't be afraid, and I'll be personally testing this comp myself in the future, right? The most important thing, just want to talk a little bit, is that Kafka was a very surprising teammate. But after diving into the explanations a little bit, it basically boils down to Kafka's very high follow-up attack frequency, as well as the ease of targeting the enemy with proof of that. Because one issue that Clara has is that you can't really aim which unit you want to cast your follow-up attack on, right? But this is not an issue with Kafka. You can always select the target. Kafka will always cast a follow-up attack on a specific target with proof of that, right? So further testing will be required, right? And then lastly, we come to the end, which is assemble team compositions. We have Clara, Tingyun, Topaz with a sustain for the optimal follow-up attack comp. We also have the Topaz, Asta, Tingyun sustain, which is going to be the hyper carry Topaz comp. And then if you want to run a slightly lower follow-up attack frequency, which is not as viable, like I mentioned in my previous video, right? Low follow-up attack frequencies like Jingyuan's Lion Lord is not going to be able to benefit Numby, since Numby is not based on the amount of damage you do per follow-up. It's based on how often you do a follow-up, right? So players, if you still want to use this, it's definitely still viable, right? With Jingyuan, Tingyun, Topaz, and then sustain. But just know that it is just not as optimal as compared to fast follow-up attacks like Clara, right? Or even Kafka, right? And with that, we've come to the end of Topaz CN unit analysis. Do let me know in the comments what you guys think of her, how was your pulls, and what's your experiences using her in Memory of Chaos or in Simulated Universe, right? If you guys want to engage in further discussions, feel free to check out my Discord, Pokke's Village, where we have a very active community talking about Honkai Star Rail on a daily basis. If you guys want to check out my stream, that's going to be twitch.tv/MrPokke. I'm streaming 3 times a week, and by the time you guys are seeing this video, I would have already went live, right? So yeah, that's going to be that for today's content. All the best for Topaz pools, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.